Good morning, everybody. Oh, wow. We've been hanging out. Those are great socks, excellent socks. I give you credit. And you're in the Trump administration. Wow. I want to read something from President Trump's speech recently on drug pricing. The president says, "Thank you very much. Thank you, please." And I want to thank Secretary Azar, Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary Ross, Ambassador Lighthizer, Commissioner Gottlieb. Scott Gottlieb has done a fantastic job. Where is Scott? Stand up, Scott. Stand up. Applause. And right to try is happening, right? You have that moving, right to try. So important. So did you get it done?
It passed yesterday.
Yeah. And is that all because of you?
I think it's the culmination of a long effort. As you know, that's been on Capitol Hill for a long time. We worked closely with the offices, particularly with Congressman Walden. I had testified earlier on the legislation on the Johnson bill, and FDA did provide technical assistance.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of FDA commissioners were opposed to it because they think it kind of sort of undermines the safety provisions and basically the methodology that the FDA brings on how to both bring drugs to market, but also maintain safety is a very high priority for the public. Do you worry at all about misapplication of this?
Well, look, we're committed to the underlying goals here of trying to get promising products to patients who are out of options. And that's why we have an expanded access program. We've invested in that. We've advanced new policy since I've been there, trying to pursue these goals. We did provide certain technical assistance on legislation, places we thought that technically improvements could be made to the legislation. But I think that some of those things we can address through the implementation process while still making sure we stay true to the letter of the law. So I think that there's things we can do to make sure patients are adequately protected under this legislation while we make sure the goals are achieved.
One of the other things, we're here talking today about drug pricing, and I know it's a high priority for you to try to figure out ways and strategies to get, I would say, a healthier ecosystem, but also one that Americans can afford. So what are the levers you're most trying to move?
Well, I think when you think of drug pricing, you think of two things, just broadly speaking, price competition and product competition. And I think where FDA is uniquely suited to try to play a role is on product competition, trying to bring more competition into the market. And that's not just with respect to generic drugs, where a lot of our focus has been, but it's also with respect to new drugs as well. I think we need to do things to try to make the process for new drug development more efficient, particularly in some of these categories where you have drugs targeting unmet needs, where the first-to-market drug goes through an accelerated process, gets to the market through a breakthrough therapy designation, comes to the market more quickly, and the follow-on competition doesn't come onto the market as quickly. So companies do have monopolies for longer periods of time than maybe they did in the past. And we're currently looking at that. We're actually doing some analysis to see what the time is between the launch of a specialty product and the launch of a subsequent product in a category. Because we know once you have 2 or 3 products in a category, you get a lot of price competition. On the generic drug side, we've done things to try to bring to market more generic drugs in categories where I think there were sometimes barriers to access to the genericization of a drug. So,
and you did 11. I mean, I'm astounded by you did 1,100 of these last year. And is that a big number? I don't know. Did they do 2,000 the year before? 5? I'm impressed by it, but I don't know. I don't have a context.
Yeah, so it's probably a 20% increase over the year prior. I think they did 850, if I'm remembering offhand.
I hear you're moving more slowly this year.
We're not moving more slowly this year. Hopefully we'll beat the number from last year. There's been the first couple of months, the numbers were down, but for a very specific reason, because we changed some of the parameters on the excipients in the products, and so the companies need to adjust, but we should catch up by the end of the year. But there's places with drugs where it's hard to develop generic alternatives, and particularly with complex drugs. And so we're trying to put out more guidance there to make the pathway more efficient for how you bring generics to some of those drugs to the market. And this is a big category of drugs where you have branded drugs that basically have monopolies well past the point of their last patent because there isn't a really efficient way to copy them. So we're trying to address that. I've talked a lot about places where I think that some branded companies engage in tactics to make it hard for the generics to do the studies they need to get to market, make it hard for them to go into the market and physically buy the doses.
Do you want to name any of those companies?
We did about a week ago.
Yeah.
So I'll send you all to my website. We tried to address that. We're going to have more policy coming out with respect to that, trying to address some of the places where branded companies might use the REMS program, the risk management plans, as a way to basically create a barrier to the generic entry into the market. And so we're looking across a whole portfolio of different places where we can help create more efficiencies in getting drugs to the market. The other place is You have these categories where you have these small market generic drugs. They might be low volume drugs. Maybe there's 1 or 2 generic entrants in the market, or maybe just one in some cases. And some speculator will come in, buy off the drug, jack up the price a lot, and know that it might take us,
Is this like the Shkreli thing?
Well, I won't mention names, but you know the examples. And it previously took an average of 42 months to get a generic onto the market on average. We've cut that down to 10 to 8 months.
Right.
And we've also said that for these single-source generic drugs, we're going to prioritize those applications. And so I think that it's going to dramatically reduce the incentive to engage in this sort of regulatory arbitrage where someone knew that they could come in, buy a low-volume drug, jack up the price, and because of the regulatory process, it would take a long time to get the second generic to the market. Now it might take only 6 months. And so I think that that's going to change the calculation on whether or not that kind of behavior is economically beneficial to a speculator.
Can you break down for me in kind of human language what gets in the way? Yesterday on this stage, I interviewed Mike McCall.
This hasn't been human language?
Well, partly it has been. It's a little wonky. I mean, you're not quite as acronym riddled as the Pentagon, but when I was with Mike McCall yesterday, we were talking about cancer drugs, and there's, I think it's called the Raise to Hope Act. I apologize to the cancer folks out here if I'm getting that wrong, but basically looking at pediatric approaches, and one of the things that they were to do in the industry is to create vouchers for companies that were creating pediatric-directed drugs, and that gave them vouchers to be able to work with the FDA and moving other items more quickly. And what came to mind, and I just don't know technically how that happens, is it gave that drug company an ability to work with the FDA in moving a product up in the line. And so I guess how resource-strapped is the FDA in dealing with all this? Because it sounds like there's a pipeline, and the pipeline takes a period of time because people seem to be willing to kind of negotiate and do things to try and get in front of that line. So that means there must be some process problems.
Well, you're talking about priority review vouchers.
Yeah.
So we've created these, Congress has created these vouchers where you can basically have a ticket to get a priority review, which is on a short time frame. The reality is whether or not it takes the FDA 10 months or 8 months to review your application, most of the time that is taken to develop a drug is really in the development process. It's not in the physical time it takes FDA to review the application. So the question is, how can we create efficiencies that make the development process much more efficient, less costly, and in some cases quicker? And
so what are some of those? Because you've mentioned it a few times that you're actually admitting that there are a lot of inefficiencies in the system.
Well, I'm not sure I would say there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system, but I think what we've done historically is that we've added new requirements, and we haven't necessarily looked systematically about how we could take away old requirements that aren't answering questions as efficiently. So I'll give you one very tangible example. We put out what we're calling the toxicology roadmap. Sorry, it's wonky. But what it basically is...
It sounds cool, actually.
It does sound cool, doesn't it? What it basically is we're looking at using things like cellular assays and a lab on a chip, other kinds of new technology to look for signs of toxicology, whereas previously we did animal models. We would test drugs in animals. And we think that some of these new tools can be more predictive than putting drugs into rats and mice and ferrets. And so we're trying to introduce this into the development process, validate these things, and create these as opportunities for companies to now test drugs against these new technologies. But the question becomes, so are we going to just add this on and still require all the same animal studies, or are we going to say, you know what, if you use these new technologies and you demonstrate success against them, you don't have to do the costly, time-consuming animal studies? And so that's an example where we can take away an old requirement that was inefficient, costly, time-consuming, introduce something that in the long run probably is going to be far more efficient, more cost savings. It might be expensive up front because some of these new technologies are expensive, but the prices will come down. So that's what we have to do. And historically what we've done is we would say, well, we're used to the animal studies. We know what they say, so we still want you to do them. And now all this new technology adds an additional measure of assurance of safety, so we want you to do that as well. I think we need to look more holistically about places we can make it more efficient, and we're doing that. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the toxicology roadmap, not just develop these new technologies, but also say what don't we have to require anymore.
Do you have like a wall at the FDA with all these drugs on it that you're trying to target and get their prices down, like showing what progress you've made?
No.
No? Don't you think it'd be a good idea?
For a regulator to selectively target individual companies?
Oh, okay. Well, so let's talk about that. Some say that you've engaged in a shaming campaign. You say you've engaged in a transparency campaign on certain firms that have gotten in the way of the genericization of some drugs. I think in this, one of the things I'm interested in the drug pricing side, and we were talking about EpiPen, for instance, and Heather
You were
Bresch.
talking about EpiPen.
Well, I asked you questions about it, but as Heather Bresch went on TV and Morning Joe and Fox and other places and sort of talking about it, began talking about the pharmacy benefit managers, the ecosystem of pricing that went in. And so I'm interested in how you look at the pricing realities out there. Do you look at a brand and say, well, that brand should be held accountable for X price, or do you look at all of the participants and say, well, there's a pricing problem in some things, and it may have multiple stakeholders?
I look at the pricing environment, and I lament places where I think the current structure of how drugs get priced in the market are creating, are frustrating our public health prerogatives. And so I'll give you an example of one place. It's hard for a biosimilar to launch into the market and gain market share because of the existence of this spread between the list versus the net price and these high rebates that get paid. So I'll give you sort of an example of how this works. If you're a biosimilar and you want to come into the market against an incumbent biological product, that biological product is on a health plan's formulary, and the manufacturer is paying a big rebate back to the health plan to keep that biologic in the preferred tier on the formulary. So if you're a biosimilar and you come in, you have to, if the health plan now takes up your biosimilar, they lose all those rebates. So now you have to discount your biosimilar to a point where you offset the loss of the rebates to the health plan, and you have to move enough patients off of the incumbent biologic onto your biosimilar to make it worth it. And that's very hard to do, because especially if the biologics aren't fully interchangeable and the health plan can't forcibly transfer patients over to the new biosimilar. So that's an example where, because the market's very hard for a biosimilar to penetrate, I worry that companies are going to pull out and not want to develop biosimilars. It costs anywhere between $100 million to $300 million to develop a new biosimilar. If they know that they can't penetrate the market, or it's going to take 10 years or 5 years to penetrate the market because of the existence of these stacked rebates, you're going to see fewer companies wanting to develop biosimilar products. So again, here's an example where the structure of the pricing environment frustrates our public health goal.
But how many biosimilars have you approved? Because my understanding is that there are biosimilars in the pipeline. And I remember doing a biosimilar program last year in which one had recently been approved by the FDA. But it sounded like on one side there's the pricing and investment structure. On the other, there's the science of biosimilars, which I think is complex and more complex than many of the other drugs. So what is the back end side of that in terms of FDA approval process for biosimilars?
I think there's 9 now approved. It might be 9 or 10. There's a pretty robust pipeline, but the question is what's behind that. The question is whether or not companies are going to continue to invest in this and see it as a market opportunity. And I think after you have a series of failed launches or biosimilars that just don't return on their investment, I've been on the other side of this, as you know, as an investor, and I think people are going to start to look at that and say maybe this isn't a place where we want to invest. And from a public health standpoint, that's not an outcome we want.
What is your footprint in trying to deal with the opioid crisis?
It cuts across a lot of different realms. I think the place where we could play the most prominent role is trying to cut down the rate of new addiction by trying to rationalize prescribing, make sure that when prescriptions are written, it's for an appropriate medical purpose. We have tools like education. We've expanded the education to all the immediate release formulations of the drugs, which represents 90% of the prescribing. And more importantly, make sure that when prescriptions are dispensed, they're dispensed for a duration that comports with the reason why the doctor wrote the prescription in the first place. So no more 30-day supplies, for an acute pain indication post-surgical. We did an analysis and looked at things like laparoscopic appendectomy and other minor procedures. It's not so minor if you have it, but and the average duration of an appropriate use of an immediate release formulation opioid is 1 to 2 days. Yet doctors still prescribe a week or a month for some of those indications. So what we're doing now is we're going to partner with an outside expert group to try to develop evidence-based guidelines on what the appropriate duration of use should be by indication. And if we can develop evidence-based guidelines in that way, we could potentially incorporate it into labeling as a way to have health plans and other intermediaries try to manage better what the dispensing is by indication. So that's one place. We do interdiction work in the international mail facilities. We recently got about $90 million from Congress in the FY18 omnibus, sorry to be wonky, to step up.
Yeah, you've had a huge swing in your budget. Everyone loves you. I mean, weren't you supposed to be cut like $700 million, and now you're up $400 million? So you've had a $1.1 billion swing, right?
So
if my math is right.
Well, you're talking about the budget I inherited, where there was a cut, and in the FY19 where we were up about $400 million in new initiatives, and the House voted out in the out of committee about $300 million of that.
But you are intervening on e-cigarettes. You've got these opioid guidelines. I mean, it's sort of when President Trump came in, he said for every every regulation I put in place, I'm going to get rid of 2 regulations. So is he allowing you all the regulations?
No, look, that first of all, that applied to regulations that cost money. A lot of our regulations actually are cost savings. If you look at how we score our regulations, we promulgated a fair number of regulations that actually reduce burdens on industry and reduce costs. Now, there are regulations that cost money. What we're trying to do with tobacco, for example, is going to be expensive. But from a public health standpoint, if you're able to dynamically score that, it would be hugely cost savings. You just aren't able to do that, or you aren't able to do that to the economic quantity in which the reality becomes manifest over time. But that's an area where we're stepping in to take a more vigorous approach, in part because and you and I were talking about this a little bit. If you were to ask me where we can have the biggest opportunity, it's on the public health basics. It's reducing smoking rates. It's making sure people get vaccinated. It's trying to use nutrition as a tool to try to promote public health and reduce the rate of chronic disease. If we can advance those 3 principles, that'll dwarf anything we could do on the new drug side. There's no single new drug that we can develop short of a cure for Alzheimer's or cancer that's going to have the magnitude of effect if we can reduce smoking rates by 5% in this country or something dramatic.
I want to go to all the audience in just a moment, but and I'm not asking this question facetiously or even jokingly, but you are, in contrast to many of your colleagues right now, sort of remarkable in how non-controversial you are. No first-class flights I've heard about, no cone of silence. Democrats that I've talked to in the Senate admire what you're doing. I've talked to a number of leading senators in the last couple of days, because knowing I was going to be talking to you, just saying, hey, and they see you doing a really, really good job. The president likes you. And so what are you, as you approach your job as a leader and thinking about the environment we're in, which is toxic, it's just toxic, what do you think you're getting right? What do you think others could learn from what you're clearly, in terms of building support on both sides to do that? I'm just sort of interested in that question, and I'm not asking facetiously, because I think it would be a good lesson to people trying to operate in this weird town right now.
So it's not my winning personality, you're saying?
I don't know. Look, it may be. I don't find you that winning.
I'll take that under advisement. Look, I had worked for 3 different FDA commissioners, and I learned a lot of lessons, and one of them was that it's very important to leverage the expertise at FDA. And I can come in with sort of a broad outlines of what I want to accomplish thematically, but the ideas need to come from the professional staff in the organization. And we've practiced that. And I think that's why we've been able to come up with a lot of new initiatives and put things out quickly and aggressively, and try to really season our agenda. You have much less time in these jobs than you think you're going to have, and so the best time to do something that you want to do is yesterday. And so we've done that. We've been pushing on things. And I think the other thing we've done is just very consciously try to elevate the public health mantle of the agency. The agency has a very seductive, mission that people broadly ascribe to, and I think we've really tried to adopt that in both the language and the policies that we put out.
It's also clear to me, and what's interesting, and I just want to put it on the table, you're promulgators of science and experimentation and results and accountability, and I just want to give you, that's good. Keep that up. Let me go to questions, comments in the audience. Yes, in the very back, we've got someone. That was a dramatic hand. Hi.
I love listening to you, Commissioner Gottlieb. Denny Van Loo from Kynapse. Can you tell us a little bit about automation? A lot of companies we work with on the regulatory space, 70% of the regulatory renewals are largely tasks that can be done over and over again. They're largely done offshore by Indian outsourcing companies. What's FDA trying to do, not just with renewals and pharmacovigilance monitoring, but overall using AI and automation to speed up the whole drug development process and reduce the cost of actually.
Great, thank you. AI, automation, and I would add particularly for these offshore inspections.
Well, I think some of what we're going to do, we're going to announce a broad initiative to try to modernize the new drug approval process probably later this month, early in June, and there's going to be a lot of elements of it that try to build in more automation of our own processes. So, for example, structured applications, where if we get information in a structured format, we can do more of the assessment in sort of an automated fashion. Some things that we do, we can use computational tools to help us leverage the analysis. And so we're trying to build this into our own process. You sound like you look like you're in a rush to get more questions in. So I'll let you go.
Another person right here.
Hi.
Who are you?
I'm Daniel Paglia from Georgetown Medical Center. I had a question regarding your use of, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but trying to transition towards using chips and using cell assays in replacement of animal studies for testing for toxicology. Don't you worry about unexpected adverse events that we could more easily catch using in vivo studies?
Yeah, that's exactly why, this is going to be a slow and deliberate process. And look, I fully ascribe to the notion that our expectation of safety for a new drug today should be, and it is, and it ought to be higher than our expectation of safety for a drug 20, 30 years ago. I mean, if you gave me a choice between driving a 1980 Taurus that's brand new, that was put on blocks and never driven, or a 2005 Toyota that has 150,000 miles on it, I'd take the Toyota, because cars have gotten much safety over time. It has side impact airbags and anti-lock brakes and all kinds of things that weren't on 1980 cars. So I think as technology gets better, our expectation of safety should improve as well. I think these tools can initially be used to sort of augment what we do with in vivo testing, but I think eventually it could be used to supplant it without any loss of assuredness of safety. But this is going to be a careful process. This is why this isn't going to be something that it's a binary switch that we just switch over one day, but we slowly integrate these tools and slowly evaluate how we can extricate old tools that aren't adding to any efficiency or any kind of assurance of safety.
Just wrapping this up, I was just thinking to myself, we have a lot of pharmaceutical company interests in the audience, and public health interests and consumer interests. But if you were to be in a congressional hearing and I were a member of Congress asking you, Commissioner Gottlieb, what is the one thing the pharmaceutical industry could do to up its game, to do a better job and to contribute to a healthier system? What would that be? What would your advice be?
Look, I have lamented some aspects of the pricing system in the marketplace, and I believe in market-based pricing for new drugs. I think it's the best way to get capital into this space. These are high-risk endeavors where they require a lot of upfront capital. There's a big time cost of capital and a lot of risk to these investments that are being made. So we need to make sure there's adequate returns on success. But I think that the structure of the way things are priced in the market leave patients who are underinsured or uninsured at a real disadvantage because of these high list prices relative to the net. And I'd like to see more opportunities to take the discounting that we know is happening in the marketplace, because net prices aren't growing that quickly. It's the list prices that are. But make sure more of that discounting is being applied to the consumers that are actually using the products.
Well, you are welcome back anytime, and you do have a winning personality. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Gottlieb, Commissioner, FDA, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.